One of the coolest parts of Star Wars has always been the massive, awe-inspiring warships, especially the fearsome Star Destroyers. Recently, we've been talking a lot about the Venator-class Star Destroyer, the backbone of the Republic Navy during the Clone Wars. We've discussed the Venator mostly in a mechanical sense, analysing the ship's specs, its capabilities, and how well it performed overall. But we've yet to touch on how the Venator actually worked. What was its crew structure like? How was the ship maintained and operated? In this video, we'll try answer some of these questions.
Attention, Sergeant on deck!
Before we begin, we'd just like to warn that this video will involve quite a bit of speculation. The lore doesn't give us everything we need to piece together a complete picture of a Venator's operations, but it gives us enough to piece together a decent image of how things worked. Now, let's get into it. At full capacity, a Venator-class Star Destroyer required a crew of 7,400, not counting up to 2,000 embarked clone troopers. It's not known if that figure counts the 500 to 600 pilots each Star Destroyer would have required, but either way, that's a lot of people, even for a kilometer-long warship. They all would have received their orders from the ship's commanding officer stationed on the starboard bridge. Beneath the ship's CO, the crew was likely split into various departments through which orders would be disseminated down the chain of command, as is the case on real-world warships. The most important members of the crew were stationed aboard the Venator's twin bridges. Structurally, these two bridges were identical, but they had different roles. The starboard bridge was the command bridge, while the port bridge was the flight control bridge. Each bridge was split into at least 3 sections, with the main bridge area at the front, a war room just behind it, and communications behind that. Both bridges likely had communications specialists, strategists, and other operations personnel, with those on the port bridge exclusively managing strategy and communications for the ship's fighter wing. The main starboard bridge is what we see most in Star Wars: The Clone Wars, so we've got a decent idea of how the crew operated there. Apart from the Star Destroyer's commanding officer, the crew pits on the starboard bridge were home to the helmsmen and navigators who steered the ship. Each pit also contained at least one officer who managed the crewmen in the pit. The crewmen on the main bridge had some level of control over the Star Destroyer's weapons, even though each gun had its own crew, but we'll discuss that more later. Apart from the bridge crew, which managed the Star Destroyer's nerve center, the most important crew aboard a Venator were the engineers. Engineering crew made sure everything was running properly and fixed it if it wasn't. These were the only members of the crew who had access to large swaths of the ship, and they would have operated in dangerous conditions, working from narrow catwalks spanning vast internal cavities deep within the ship. Of course, they were also responsible for maintenance in the crewed regions as well. The ship's engineers had a small army of droids to assist them in these tasks, though it's unknown how many there were and whether they were included in the crew totals. The crewed decks of the Venator ran along the edge of the ship, from the forward tractor beam projectors to the end of the aft wings, as well as through the Star Destroyer's main tower and a thin strip around its base. The majority of the ship's interior was divided between hangar space and internal systems. The bulk of the aft section was taken up by a series of huge cavities which housed the main reactor, a pair of auxiliary reactors, the hyperdrive and inertial compressor, the reactants. 2 more cavities ran along the forward half of the ship between the main hangar and the outer crewed areas, containing tractor beam projectors, shield generators, and other vital infrastructure. These spaces were crossed by only a handful of armored corridors and engineering access walkways. In the crewed areas, most of the crew would have been engineers, deckhands, or part of crew support. The Star Destroyer had living facilities for roughly 10,000 people, most of them probably located in the main tower. These facilities would have required a wide variety of support personnel, including quartermasters, mess hall workers, and security. The ship's pilots likely had their own living facilities and mess halls, probably close to the main hangar, and its embarked troops likely had their own sections as well. The Venator also had onboard medical personnel and at least one medical center, and since it was a warship, it probably had armories as well, with their own staff and a master-at-arms. Of course, with the Venator being a warship and all, a significant portion of its crew were gunners. At the very least, the 8 main DBY-827 heavy turbolaser turret each had their own crews located in a fire control room between the 2 barrels of the turbolasers, with each gun commanded by its own officer. At least some of the lesser guns had crews as well. The Venator's flak guns, located along gunnery decks running along the broadsides of the ship, were all crewed, not automated, as we saw firsthand in Revenge of the Sith. We'd wager that the torpedo tubes and medium turbolasers had crews as well. That leaves only the Star Destroyer's 52-point defense laser cannons, which were at least partially automated since they were meant to track fighter craft that moved faster than any organic gunner could track. Many real-world point defense guns are automated for exactly this reason. Despite it being canon that the Venator's main guns had their own crews, Star Wars The Clone Wars implies that there were also gunners in the main bridge's crew pits. These might have been officers handing down orders to the various gunnery crews, or all of the Star Destroyer's guns might have been partly automated, allowing for remote control from the bridge, if with less accuracy. Both of these scenarios were probably the case. Lastly, the Venator had a particularly large flight operations division. Hangar crew had to manage 192 V-Wings, V-19 Torrents or Z-95 Headhunters, 192 ETA-2 Interceptors, Delta-7 Interceptors or A-6 Interceptors, 36 ARC-170s, 40 LAAT gunships and or LAAT dropships, 24 heavy military walkers, typically ATTEs, and a scattering of shuttles and support craft. All of these vehicles needed to be fueled, armed, maintained, and repaired between fights. Upon launching, they also required assistance from flight control personnel. On a ship with as large a carrying capacity as the Venator, this required a small army, not even counting the other personnel required to manage the deck crews and keep the hangars organized. Most flight operations crewmen would have been stationed in the main hangar area, since the ventral hangar was mostly used for docking with smaller ships, and the broadside hangars were typically used as docking ports. Operations in the main hangar were managed from a command post at the far end of the main flight deck, while control operations were managed from the port bridge. Of course, most personnel would have been found in the hangars themselves, maintaining the Star Destroyer's starfighters and other craft. As with the crew and engineering, they were assisted by a small army of droids, especially the astromechs assigned to the warship starfighters. Now that we've accounted for the crew of a Star Destroyer, let's try and break down that 7,400 figure from earlier. We're going to assume the roughly 600 pilots aren't counted in that figure, but that officers were. In the latter case, if the later Imperial 1 class Star Destroyer is any indication, officers probably made up a quarter of the crew, or roughly 1,850 personnel. This included not just bridge officers, but the leaders of various other crew departments. Gunnery crews, meanwhile, would likely have been small based on the figures for the Imperial 1, with at most a dozen crew per turbolaser or missile tube, totaling just 168 gunners. Of the remaining enlisted personnel, a majority were probably flight crew. Considering there are about 500 craft aboard each Star Destroyer, we guess that around 3,000 enlisted crewmen were assigned to the hangars. That leaves about 2,400 enlisted crew, the bulk of which were likely in engineering. 7,400 crew is a lot of people for just one ship, but as far as Star Destroyers went, the Venator was actually on the lower side of crew demands. The larger Imperial 1 class Star Destroyer required a crew of nearly 40,000, with room for 9,000 stormtroopers. But what do you think? Do you like these sorts of in-depth ship-focused videos? Feel free to leave your thoughts in the comments section below, and as always guys, thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you in the next video.